Let's just start with the obvious question. In one sentence, why does Mayor Pete Buttigieg want to be president?
Well, America's at a moment of profound change, and we've got to make sure that we figure out a way to make those changes work for us rather than let them tear us apart. I come from definitely a different background than a lot of my competitors. I'm a mayor of a city in the industrial Midwest. I represent a new generation, serve my country in the military, and my life has been personally affected by the kinds of decisions that are made by politicians in Washington, D.C. I want to make sure that we have a new kind of leadership to deal with the issues that are really going to decide how the rest of this century is going to go and create or destroy opportunities for people my age and those who are going to come after us.
When I said to a friend of mine I was going to come down and spend some time with you, she said that I should ask, he's 37 years old. What does he know about anything?
Well, the best answer I have to the question of age is experience. I have more government experience than the President of the United States, and that might be a low bar, but I've got more executive government experience than the Vice President, and I have more military experience than anybody who has walked into that office on day one since George H.W. Bush. The experience of being a mayor of a city of any size is one where you are on the hook day to day for decisions ranging from economic development to emergency management. I know what it is to get a phone call at 3 a.m. I also know what it is to gather advice and take counsel on things I don't already understand to try to make better decisions. And I would argue that that kind of preparation is no less of a preparation than spending years soaking in the ways of Washington. I know it's more traditional to come out of the Congress or the Senate, but you could also be a very senior member of the Congress or the Senate and have never in your life managed more than a few dozen people. It's different when you've been leading a city, and I think that's the kind of experience that's most relevant to the job today.
Why not run for Congress first, or why not run for the Senate? Why not run for governor? Use it as a stepping stone, use it as an opportunity to gain some legislative experience.
This isn't about my career. This is about our country, and I don't believe in running for an office so that you can run for some other office. Every time I've decided to run for an office, and every time I've decided to not run for an office, which has happened several times, it's about reading the moment, thinking about what's needed, and then asking if the combination of skills and experiences that I have, that I bring to the table, could be the right answer. And look, I'm as surprised as anybody that I'm doing this right now, and for it to be catching on as quickly as it has.
You're surprised by all of this?
I was not expecting to spend my 38th year running for president until maybe roughly a year ago that the idea began to pick up steam. And I'm certainly surprised by how quick it caught on. I believe I have the right message. I believe I have the right story. But frankly, we were planning to spend this spring and summer simply introducing ourselves, fighting to make it into the debate, and thought it would be a little later in the cycle before we entered the top tier that we're now in this competition.
Why do you think you've caught fire the way you have?
Well, I think it's that people are looking for something different. They still want experience, at least government experience like I've had, or military experience, but they want something very different from what they're seeing, not just in the White House, but maybe in the party too. I come from a red state, a blue city and a purple county in a red state that's been through the kinds of experiences when we lost our industry that have motivated a lot of people who were taken in by the message of this administration. You know, this White House is selling to communities like mine the idea that the only way we can ever succeed is to stop and go back into the past. And I just don't believe that, and I don't represent that. You know, our city changed its trajectory by being very honest about how the future was going to look different than what came before, and then figuring out how to make that future work for us. Not that we've conquered all of our challenges, but we've changed the trajectory of our city. I want to do the same thing for our country. And the other thing I've observed is the opportunity to build a kind of a generational alliance from students to people my parents' age who care about the future and are excited about the idea of inviting a new generation of leadership to serve at the highest levels.
You are, as you indicated, a bit of a rising star, $7 million, I believe, in the first quarter alone in terms of fundraising, and yours is a compelling story. One of the criticisms, though, continues to be a lack of specificity when it comes to policy proposals. I checked out your website again a short time ago. No policy papers there. Elizabeth Warren, she has, I believe, a dozen at last check. Some of your other fellow contenders have also put out some specific policy positions. Why haven't you?
I've put out a number of specific policy proposals, from leading the field on opening up the subject of reforming the structure of the Supreme Court, to talking about elements of college affordability that haven't gotten a lot of attention. I've been one of the first people to say out loud, I think, in the context of this race, that we need carbon pricing or a carbon tax as part of the fight on climate change. And we'll continue to offer more ideas in the policy space that help make it very clear where I stand. But there's more at stake than just the elegance of the designs of our policies. I'm a policy guy. I've also watched my party sometimes fail to connect with voters, because while we're explaining our policies, we sometimes forget to explain the values that motivate our policies, or we forget to explain what they mean on the ground. I believe in doing all three, and you're going to see certainly plenty of policy detail, whether it's a traditional format like the website or in other ways through social media, that I think we can communicate our policy plans. We're also going to hear a lot about values and a lot about results, because I'm worried that sometimes if we only communicate in terms of the legislation, a lot of people get lost in that detail.
Let's go back to your college affordability plan. Are we talking about free college for all?
I think that it's difficult to promise that we can pay the last penny of college even for the child of a billionaire when we haven't even gotten on top of some more basic affordability questions. So I think we need an expansion of Pell Grants. I think we need the ability to refinance student debt. I think we need to act on the way that when your debt is forgiven with income-based repayment, the way that that's taxed. I think we need to press states to step up and cover more college costs so it isn't falling on the students in the form of tuition, and take a number of other steps that are going to expand access to college. But I also believe one problem that we may have unintentionally created in this country is this message that the only way to succeed is to go to college. Anybody who belongs in college, who wants to go to college, especially if they're first generation and they're disadvantaged, I want to make that possible for them. But it should also be the case that if you are working hard in a job and doing a good job, even if you don't have a college degree, you should be able to enjoy a good and comfortable life in this country. You should be able to afford to be generous. And a lot of working Americans have almost gotten the message that if you didn't go to college, there's something wrong with you. I think we've got to do something about that too, because the majority of Americans who don't have a college degree deserve to live secure and prosperous lives.
Do you think we put too much of an emphasis on higher education in this country?
I'm a product of higher education, and it's very important to me.
Elite education, not just higher education.
You might say that, yeah. I had an amazing undergraduate education, and then the benefit of a scholarship that allowed me to go overseas and study at Oxford. I want anybody who seeks to have that opportunity to be able to have it. I also, though, think that we have sometimes taken our eye off the value of things like technical education, and our eye off the fact that anybody working at any job, at any skill level, ought to be able to make at least a living wage. It's why the fight for at least $15 an hour is so important, and it's why the fight for things like universal health care matters a great deal in whether this is going to be the kind of country we want it to be.
Perhaps you've heard Joe Biden in the race now,
heard.
sits atop just about every major poll out. And there's also some thinking that Mr. Biden speaks to the same kind of voter you were speaking to, working class voters who feel left behind in this country. Why would one of them vote for someone who's untested and unproven instead of a Joe Biden?
Well, I think I've been tested and proven, whether it's in my role in government as a mayor of a city with a lot of challenges, or whether it's in my military service. I also just represent, I think, a very different messenger, a different package from any of my competitors. There's, I guess, 20 and counting. And I think one of the reasons we've been able to cut through is that we represent something different. I'm hoping to appeal to anyone who is focused on the future. That includes anybody from a blue-collar worker in the industrial Midwest to a transgender woman of color, which, by the way, could be the same person. So instead of slicing and dicing all of the different constituencies in our party, I'm trying to have messages that are not only specific to how any individual is going to be made better off, but also how we can express that common sense of belonging and common desire for a better life that can unite America at a time when we're being divided and carved up, especially by a president that seems focused on dividing us against one another for political gain.
So you don't buy this idea that you and the Democratic frontrunner appeal to the same kind of vote?
Look, I think anyone competing for the Democratic nomination is competing to appeal to Democrats. But there's a lot of different kinds of Democrats of all ages and in backgrounds and in different geographies. And it's going to be a stiff competition, but a very healthy one. When there's as many of us as there are, I think it's befitting of any individual candidate to just run your own game plan. I'm not competing against any one competitor. I'm competing against the House. And what I've got to do is have a compelling message and present the kind of leader I seek to be for this country, and then allow voters to decide how that compares to all of the others.
You are here in South Carolina because it's very hard to win the Democratic nomination without winning this state. As you know, it's hard to win this state without turning out black voters. That is a constituency with which you seem to have had some trouble so far, not polling well among black voters. I've seen a number of your rallies. They are fairly homogenous, racially speaking at least. How do you plan to speak to African American voters specifically?
Well, part of it is by laying out an agenda on the issues that black voters are asking me about most often. Democracy and the way that a lot of voters of color have been excluded or found their voices diminished, or the issues that really are going to be tackled by that democracy. Home ownership, entrepreneurship, health, education, criminal justice reform. But a lot of it's also about a relationship. The black voters who know me best, the voters in South Bend, which is a racially diverse city, helped return me to office with an overwhelming majority in the primary and in the general election. But not all of the voters in places like South Carolina know me that well. And when you arrive and you're a newcomer, and you're not yourself a candidate of color, and you're also not somebody who's been a household name for years or decades, it takes a lot of work to make sure people get to know you. I am determined to do that work because I'm determined to compete here in South Carolina, and so our outreach is just getting warmed up, but it's going to continue as we go.
You mentioned your relationship with black voters there in South Bend and home ownership. As I've read it, though, the eviction rate in South Bend, it's higher than the national average.
That's right. Yeah, South Bend, like many diverse low-income communities, has a high eviction rate. We have one of the highest formal eviction rates in the country. It's a very serious concern. It's one reason why we've been acting to connect low-income people who are often wrongfully evicted with legal resources to defend themselves. But I'm also very proud of the way that we worked in collaboration with largely low-income and minority neighborhoods to get residents resources to repair their homes and stay in them. Or when there were homes that were vacant for years and collapsing on themselves and harming the neighbors, that we removed those homes. We did everything that we could find to help benefit all residents, particularly disadvantaged residents like neighborhoods of low-income and minority residents of the city of South Bend. And I think it's one of the reasons why I was able to get so much support from minority residents when I stood up for re-election in our city.
Why is the poverty rate among African Americans in South Bend also higher than the state average?
Well, first of all, we're a low-income community. Our per capita income is about $20,000. The roots of this begin in 1963 when we lost our biggest employer by far. We were a company town for the Studebaker Car Company. And even 50 years later, when I was first taking office, we were living through the legacy of that, broken down houses and empty factories, and like many patterns of economic inequality and disadvantage, often the minority communities were the hardest hit. But I will say, given the economic challenges that were there when I took office, we've been able to reduce the poverty rate. We've been able to dramatically see unemployment and employment numbers head in the right direction. And again, I think that's part of how we earned the vote of confidence that I got from my own residents when I got reelected with 80% of the vote.
Polls show that Americans are open to the idea of electing a gay candidate. A Quinnipiac poll just out shows that folks are open to the idea, but by a 2-to-1 margin, they don't think that America is ready for a gay president. How do you overcome that? How do you overcome this idea that I might be ready for it, but the country at large is not?
People just need to get to know you. And I've heard people say the same thing about electing presidents from any number of minorities or other categories. At the end of the day, people need to know who they're voting for. And, when I came out, it was in the middle of a re-election campaign in a socially conservative, if largely Democratic community, at a time when Mike Pence was the governor of our state. And the result, which we didn't know what the politics of it would be, I just realized I'd reached the point in my life where I wanted people to know who I was, and I wanted to be able to start having more of a personal life. The end result of that was getting reelected with 80% of the vote. I believe that Americans can look past prejudices and biases in order to do the right thing. And I have a lot of faith in that. We're also going to do the hard work to make sure that Americans are understanding in this election that it's about them. It's not about the president. It's not about me. It's about what's going to happen in the everyday lives of voters, because we go this way instead of that way. What it means to vote for somebody who's trying to get you a raise, who's trying to defend your ability to get health care, who's arguing that we need a stronger and more democratic democracy, who's determined to put an end to endless war. These are the things that I think are going to motivate most voters. I think they're part of why we've been catching on so far, and I think they'll carry us all the way through to the White House.
On Friday, you were heckled by a protester in Dallas, and I believe this has happened a couple of times. You've had folks that get up and scream things at you periodically during your speeches. How much has that surprised you? Have you been surprised that there have been people who have been so vocal in their opposition to your lifestyle?
In politics, you see the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think it happens for any candidate. It certainly happens to candidates who belong to one or another minority. You can't let that throw you. If I'm speaking to 1,000 people and a couple of them come there to yell at me, I can't let that dominate the agenda.
But they're not yelling at you over policy. They're yelling at you because you're gay. Yeah. That doesn't bother you at all.
It's not like I enjoy it, but I have a responsibility to keep the focus on what we're actually trying to do, and to try to open people's minds and open people's hearts and make sure people are hearing a message about where America's headed. There's so much more at stake right now than me or any other individual. This is about making sure that by the time we get to 2054, and I'm the current age of the current president, that we're able to look back and say that we stopped America from sliding into being a terminally divided, less democratic, less equal nation forever. So much depends on what we do in these next few years. I think the rest of my lifetime will largely be decided by the choices that we are about to make. And that's about substance. It is about everyday life in this country and how it's affected by the people making decisions in those big white buildings. And that's what we're getting a response to.
This sounds a lot like hope and change.
In a way, I'm filled with hope. Running for office is an act of hope. You don't do it unless you believe that by running and competing and winning and governing, you can make a big difference in the life of this country.
The message, though, the message that you are preaching, it sounds similar.
In many ways, yes. I suppose the biggest difference is that I think there is change now happening with or without us. This isn't just about the change I want to bring to Washington. This is about the fact that huge tectonic change is coming to our country. I'd say an era that's probably lasted 40 years of Democrats and Republicans governing in a certain way. It kind of started with Reagan, that has come to an end. That the Republican Party, as we know it, has come to an end. And that the Democratic Party has to decide what it's going to be going into the future. This isn't about whether I can only about whether I can introduce change. This is about whether America will survive the pressures that are being put on us from outside and from within. And those changes have to be mastered if we want to be able to live a good life for the balance of this 21st century.
As you've probably heard, Special Counsel Robert Mueller tentatively set to testify before the House Judiciary Committee on May 15th. If you were on that committee, what would you want to know from Robert Mueller?
Well, I think that the opportunity for him to characterize his own report rather than it happening through other people is important. Because obviously the summary or the letter or whatever you want to call it was written almost in a way that seemed like it was in a different world than the report itself. And I think this administration is counting on the idea that most people will never read the report. So it's that much more important to get its author to have a chance to characterize what he thinks he saw. At the same time, my role in this process is to try to replace this president by defeating him politically. So Congress is going to do what Congress is going to do. But there are a lot of people, frankly, who voted for this president with no illusions about whether he is honorable or decent or even likely to uphold the law. They voted to burn the House down. They voted out of a sense of dark frustration with the economy and the democracy that we live in that left them susceptible to an incredibly divisive message that came from this president. And if we're not paying attention to the symptoms that made it possible for somebody like him to exploit our divisions, then we could see something equivalent or even worse come along And it's not just a question of what happens to this individual in the White House today.
One of the more striking elements, to me at least, that came out in the report, the depth to which Russia managed to infiltrate our election, so to speak. Their election meddling, the size and the scope of it. Hypothetically, if you were president, how would you treat Russia differently? How would you treat other countries that try to meddle in our elections?
Our democracy doesn't just keep us whole, it keeps us safe. And an attack on our democracy is an attack on this country. It is an extremely serious thing and is not being taken very seriously by this White House for obvious reasons. So there
What are
needs
the obvious reasons?
Well, the reason that this White House benefited from that interference. I mean, the frightening thing here isn't just the fact that we were attacked. It's that a hostile foreign adversary believed that a great way to make America weaker was to interfere to get this person elected. And it worked. America's weaker. America's more divided. America has come to harm. And we need to prevent that from ever happening again. And that means that if an attack, and I do call it an attack, on our democracy comes from that country or any other country, we need to be prepared to deter that. And I believe that we have a whole suite of options to preserve our security, cyber options, diplomatic options, and economic options that should be certainly on the table when we're thinking about how to deter another hostile action to make our country worse off.
After intelligence suggested that Iranian forces or their proxies were threatening U.S. troops in the region, there is now an aircraft carrier group that is en route, as you know. You spent a number of years as a Naval Reserve officer, 6 months in Afghanistan. Do you think that is an appropriate response?
It's tough to know all of the facts on the ground right now, especially since so much of it has not been shared with the American people. I know this much. It's certainly true that as a regional actor, Iran in general and the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps in particular, have often been problematic bad actors. It's also true that the U.S. doesn't seem to have a policy for how to stabilize that region. On the contrary, by withdrawing from the nuclear deal, which, by the way, was not designed as a favor to Iran, it was designed as a way to reduce the nuclear threat in that region. By withdrawing from that and not having any clear proposal of what we're going to do next, I think we've diminished our foothold when it comes to regional security in the Persian Gulf. The bottom line has to be American safety and security. It's what I put my life on the line to defend when I was in the military, and I hope that it is the main concern of this president. But I always worry these days that when they do something with American troops, it might have as much of a domestic political motive as it does anything related to our actual security needs.
I want to go back to something you said, because were you suggesting universal basic income?
What?
Universal basic income. You talked about a livable wage. I didn't
well,
know.
First of all, we just got to raise the minimum wage to $15, and it probably has to be more in more expensive regions. I also think that without people saying it, in many ways, overtime is the new minimum wage because the overtime limit has been set so low that a lot of people are being overworked and undercompensated. It's why in the city of South Bend, as an employer, when they blocked the Obama-era overtime rules, we just unilaterally decided to abide by them for our own employees. The conversation about guaranteed income is an interesting one. There are experiments underway right now, and I'd like to see how those pan out. But even if we do guaranteed income, which is a really interesting set of proposals, it doesn't absolve us from this basic question of how do we make capitalism actually work for us? I'm for democratic capitalism, a way to make sure that our business world and our government are actually working to make most Americans better off. The reason you see such skepticism, cynicism even, about our government and our economy is that it's no longer working for most people. It turns out a rising tide does not automatically lift all boats, especially when you have policies that benefit those who are already the best off. That's what we have right now. The administration is making it worse. Americans agree with the Democratic Party that we need to raise wages and improve benefits. Now we have to go out there and actually do it.
Two of the front runners in your party, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, roughly twice your age. What does that say to you about where your party is right now?
Well, I think our party is certainly ready to lift up leaders from a new generation. We've seen it in the Congress. Some of the most important figures in Congress just got there, and they're younger than I am. And I think it's one of the reasons why, from relative obscurity, my campaign and I have been able to explode onto the scene very quickly. Now, of course, there's also a lot of known quantities in this race. And the exciting thing is that I think this race will create a fair playing field where people who've been in the public sphere for longer than I've been alive, and people like me, get to compete on the basis of our ideas, on the basis of who we are, and what kind of messenger we'll represent. And I think that last part's actually really important, because even though we're going to identify some policy disagreements on the margins, the truth is most every Democrat broadly agrees on at least 80% of what we ought to be doing as a country. And so more and more as this race starts to winnow down from the 20 of us or whatever it is to a handful that people can get their arms around, I think the real distinguishing factor will be what kind of messenger can I picture speaking for me, winning this election, and leading this country.
We've seen this from time to time in our politics. There's a man or a woman who manages to capture a lot of attention for a while, and then they fizzle, they fade, they peter out. What's different this time?
It's fair to say that I've outlived the flavor of the month period. It's been more like 2 months since I first
arrived.
So
you could be the flavor
stage,
of 2 months, not just the flavor of a month.
Well, gosh, with this many of us in it, some people will be lucky to be the flavor of a day. But, you know, we are very mindful that vaulting into the top 3 or top 5 or however you count in May is nice, but it doesn't win you the election. We've got a lot of work to do now that is the unglamorous, on-the-ground blocking and tackling and organizing, especially in the early states, that really carries you through to the nomination, and that's going to be our focus. I think we've established that this is not a flash in the pan. We've got a lot of work to do to consolidate our support and to grow it further.